This segment is titled The Big Picture. So what do we mean when we speak of seeing the big picture? Before we answer that question, I want you to join me in a little exercise that illustrates a process that is integral to the understanding of the principles involved in learning to put the fork down. This is my signature demonstration. On the slides that follow are 10 sets of pictures. The first picture of the set is a close-up shot. The second picture is zoomed out to normal range. These are all common items that you will easily recognize once you view the normal, or what I call the default, picture. This exercise is meant to have a little fun, of course, and to get the neurons warmed up and firing. But it is also meant to illustrate in a graphic way what this series is all about. Grab a piece of paper and record how many of them you get correct. Well, how did you do? Both pictures in each set were of the same item. So what was it about the second shot that made the picture more easily recognizable? And how do you suppose that illustrates what this series is all about? Well, the second shot obviously contained more information and was taken from a different perspective. Our brains have become accustomed to seeing things from a certain perspective. We call that our default perspective. When we change that perspective, however, these familiar things become almost impossible to recognize. But with a bit of practice, we can get better. So let's practice. I'm going to show you these slides again and see how many you get right this time. How did you do the second time around? If you're like most people, you scored better, much better. In my groups, we typically get 100% correct on the second time around. How does this happen? Well, when our brains do the search for the initial picture, that micro shot, they come up empty. But in the process of doing that search, our brains build a representation of that image in our working memory. And as we explore further in the next segment of this series, our brains literally create hundreds of thousands of tiny connections called synapses to snap a picture of that first image. When the second image comes into view, our brains do something really cool. They wire a link between the unknown image and the familiar one. We literally change the relationship between the neurons in the brain. When the neural circuit that contains the new image is fired and the familiar image is fired, that circuit is fired too, at roughly the same time, the neural circuits and the synapses between them change chemically. Their chemically altered state now means that when one fires, it will be a stronger trigger to fire the other. So over time, the connection between the two grows so strong that they fire simultaneously in a shared response instead of at random. Now this is known as Hebbian plasticity, named after Donald Hebb, a Canadian neuropsychologist who discovered the phenomenon in the 1970s. Now the layman's version of this concept is simply this: neurons that fire together wire together. So after one trip through the pictures, we have created some new architecture in the brain that ensures that these two circuits will fire together. This whole process is known as neuroplasticity, which literally means that the brain is plastic in nature and can be molded into very different configurations, an infinite number. And the tool that does this molding is thought itself. This process that occurs hundreds of thousands of times in our brains every single day. The trouble is that most of us are doing very little to control this process. So if we're going to get good at putting the fork down, we have to control this process and make it work for us. Controlling this process is at the heart and soul of this series. So another way to think about this is to think about perspectives. When we think of seeing the big picture, what we really mean is this. We really mean stepping far enough back and taking in enough information to gain a different or better perspective. And that's what this series is all about. Creating a whole different way of looking at or thinking about how we consume food.